Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak to you today. I started with that picture for my talk because I have a confession to make. I'm going to lay out my cards straight away on the table. I am a traveller, and I travel a lot. And I have travelled all around the world. I've been to all 7 continents many times. And that's a picture of me in front of an ice cave. I think that was in Antarctica. And I've travelled for work, I've travelled for writing, I've travelled, and I've done a lot of corporate travel. So in 2019, I calculated that I was actually away for 2/3 of my time, and I thought that's probably too much. I ought to cut down on it. In 2020, I'm going to cut down my travel, I said to myself. And I overshot, like all of us. And in fact, at the beginning, it was great. It was like, all these nights in the same bed, it's lovely. Okay, I'm getting really kind of restless now. And I was one of those dogs out of that cage the very second it was possible. So I'm saying that because I'm about to talk to you about climate change. And travel is one of the sectors that can get the most, it's right there in the crosshairs for climate change. And I'm going to tell you some stuff that you're going to have to brace yourselves because it's going to get really ugly. But I'm also starting off by saying I am a traveller, and I work with industry, and I work to find solutions for every single part of the economy. And that's going to be utterly, utterly essential for what we do about climate change. So I'm going to show you some scary stuff, and I'm going to talk to you about some solutions. And really good solutions. I have a lot of hope and expectation about this whole industry. And then we're going to do a panel where we'll kind of pick apart some of the things that I've been saying and open up to you all for questions and comments on that. So that's how we're going to go. But brace yourself because it's going to start to get ugly first. So, travel industry, look at that, 10% of global GDP, 10% of all the world's jobs, or at least it did before COVID hit, 8% of the world's greenhouse emissions, and rising, of which about 20% is from corporate travel. So I'm going to focus today on climate change and greenhouse emissions. The general topic was sustainability. Climate change is at the root of all of that. The Pentagon calls it a threat multiplier. Climate change has implications for so many of the other aspects of how we actually make a sustainable business. But also, many of the solutions to climate change are the ones that we're also going to have to implement to make business truly sustainable. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about climate change. When I started working on climate change more than 20 years ago, it was actually quite hard to find pictures to illustrate the kinds of changes that the scientists were saying we should expect. And I'm a scientist by background. Now it's actually slightly hard to choose, and I'm going to come to that in a moment. But first of all, I'm going to show you just an idea of how varied our climate actually is. It changes a lot. From year to year, from a 5-year period to 5-year period. So here's a map of the world, starting in 1880. I'm going to go forward from 1880 to the present day, and you'll see how much the global climate changes. Now, 1880, because that was the first time that we actually started to get global temperature records with ships going all around the world. So global temperatures from 1880 to the present day. If it goes a bit bluer, it's going to be a bit colder. If it goes a bit redder or yellower, it's going to be a bit warmer. So let's go forwards. So you can see actually that was a period when it's quite a cold period there for quite a while, and then it got a bit warmer in the Arctic, and that was a bit warm, then it went cold again. You can see how it's really very variable until you get to the 70s, and to the 80s, and the 90s, and the 2000s. Thing is, it's not subtle. It's really not subtle anymore. It used to be that climate change is on its way, and now it's climate change is actually with us, with some quite spectacular implications. So first of all, let's pick forest fires. I said it's actually hard to choose which pictures to put up to illustrate the things that we're experiencing now. So do I put the fires that devastated Australia at the beginning of 2020 that I thought was going to be the story of the year before COVID came along, or the ones that have been devastating California, or the small town in Canada that actually burst spontaneously into flame after it had experienced like 45-degree temperatures for 3 days in a row. It's actually quite hard to choose. Then there's also coral bleaching. I put this in here because we are talking about travel. I know it's about corporate travel, but nonetheless, if you like corals, go soon. The Great Barrier Reef is actually currently experiencing its 6th major bleaching, and it's the 4th one in the last 10 years. And corals can survive if they bleach 1 year, 2 years, but if it's 4 times in 10 years, the Great Barrier Reef is not long for this world now. Also, droughts. So we're getting droughts right across the tropics. It's already having an impact on food production. And that's a bad thing in itself, but it's also having an impact on something else which directly affects all of us in this room right here, because it has an effect on migration. Now, if you think about the migration that has been coming for Europe and has been coming for North America before the Ukraine war hit, the migration in Europe was coming from Syria and from Darfur, from the Sahel in North Africa. And then in North America, it's coming from Guatemala and Central America. Now, all 3 of those places were suffering from war, they were suffering from civil strife, and they had good reasons why people had to leave their homes. But in all 3 cases, they started with a prolonged drought. And I've spoken to a military general who said the migration we're seeing at the moment is a walk in the park compared to what we're going to expect if we let climate change really take hold. Also floods. So flooding can take place through more intense storms and through rising sea level, or through a combination of the two. I put this one in. Do you remember this is when St. Mark's Square in Venice flooded? It was a couple of years ago. And I put this in particularly because it's the first known example, as far as I'm concerned, of instant climate karma. Because while this was happening, the local politicians in Venice were actually meeting to decide if they should implement climate-friendly policies in the region. And they vetoed these climate-friendly policies. And count them, 2 minutes later, here is what happened to the council chamber. Instant climate karma. But you don't just get floods from rising sea level and more intense rainfall. You also get storms. And this is, for me, at least at the moment, one of the most frightening things that we've seen most recently and spectacularly, which is these incredible hurricanes that have been showing up around the world. Not more of them, but more intense hurricanes. And again, it's actually quite hard to choose. All the hurricanes that have been devastating the Caribbean, but there's also been the hurricanes, the typhoons in the South China Sea and so on. I was giving a talk just before COVID hit, and it was in October 2019, and I was in Toronto. I was speaking to a bunch of retail investors, and I showed a picture of a particular hurricane, Irma, I think. It had devastated the island of Barbuda, and they said that it looked like a lawnmower had gone across the island and completely flattened it. And so I had a Hurricane Irma up there. Now, a guy came up to me afterwards and said, you shouldn't put Irma, you should put Dorian, the one that's just gone through the Barbados, the one that's just gone through the Bahamas. Now, I said to him, why Dorian? And he said, he's a retail investor, very high net worth individual. He said, I used to have a house in the Bahamas. He said, I don't anymore. He said, it looked like a nuclear bomb had hit it. He also said to me, by the way, and I'm hearing this a lot these days, I used to be a climate denier, he said. I'm not anymore. And by the way, that analogy of a nuclear bomb is not bad, because the amount of heat energy that we're putting in the atmosphere at the moment is the equivalent to 4 Hiroshima bombs every second. That's why it's getting so hotter, and that's why the storms are getting so much more intense. Okay, who's this? Lance Armstrong. It's Lance Armstrong. Why do I have Lance Armstrong in the middle of all this terrifying stuff? The reason is he's holding up 7 fingers for the 7 times that he won the Tour de France. And you can say, well, which of those times did the fact that he was taking steroids make it more likely that he would win? Was it the first time? Was it the third time? Was it the fourth? Or you can more sensibly say, by taking steroids, he was making all of those wins more likely. And ladies and gentlemen, we are putting our atmosphere on steroids, and we are making all of those so-called natural disasters more likely. So in September last year, the IPCC put out another of their terrifying scientific reports, saying this is a scientific basis of what we're saying is now happening with climate change. And this is how the UK papers reported it. Code red for humanity, global climate crisis, inevitable, unprecedented, and irreversible. I was going to use a strong word there. It's flipping terrifying, right? It is flipping terrifying. And it reminds me, because the UN Secretary General, on February the 28th, This was a headline that was buried because it was right in the middle of the beginning of the Ukraine war. The IPCC put out a second report where this one was talking about what the risks are, what the need for adaptation, where the vulnerabilities lie. And the UN Secretary General called it an atlas of human suffering. An atlas of human suffering. In other words, there was no part of the world that wasn't being touched by this. And it reminded me of a poem by the very brilliant Warsan Shire, who was actually, her parents were refugees from Somalia. And I'm just going to tell you 4 lines of this. Brace yourselves. Here's a poem, it goes. I put an atlas on my knee and ran my fingers over the whole world and whispered, where does it hurt? And it answered, everywhere. 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 That is where we are right now. Now, I wanted you to know that and to feel it, because it's actually too easy to go, this is too hard and we need to look away and we're trying to do other stuff. And I've told you from the beginning, I am a traveler. I work with business. I work with industry. I find solutions. And the solutions are all out there. And this is why we have to do it. So you remember the kids when they were out there, our planet, our fight. We're going to fight for our planet. But I've just said this is everywhere. Everywhere, including here in London. And that's why I put up this. This is Sarah Breeden of the Bank of England. And here's what she said about climate risks. Climate risks are uncertain but predictable. They will affect every consumer and every corporate in all sectors and in all geographies. In other words, you can't just move away from this. And that's why this is not any longer just for the kids who are out in the streets saying, save our planet. That's why climate change has become utterly mainstreamed, particularly in the financial services sector and particularly among investors and lenders. And I think that is now absolutely game-changing because they are giving permission, they're giving air cover, they are channeling capital to the places where we can actually get the solutions. So this is Larry Fink. In January 2020, he said, climate change has become a defining factor in companies' long-term prospects. I believe, listen to this, we're on the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance. This is not the CEO of Greenpeace saying this. This is Larry Fink, the CEO of the world's biggest asset manager. In January 2021, after COVID had clobbered us, here's what he said. In March, the conventional wisdom of the crisis would divert attention from climate, but just the opposite took place, and the reallocation of capital accelerated even faster than I anticipated. The pandemic has reminded us how the biggest crises, whether medical or environmental, demand a global and ambitious response. And by the way, the same thing is happening with the Ukraine crisis. It is not putting climate change on the side, it's accelerating action on climate. And I think we can keep on expecting crises, I'm sorry to say, and we can keep on expecting that acceleration. So, net zero. In 2019, net zero was almost nowhere. A few people were talking about it, it was a kind of vaguely hippie notion. Now, more than 80% of global GDP generators are either have their own net zero target or are operating in a territory that has a net zero target. In other words, nowadays, if you don't have a net zero target, you're not at the table. And if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And here is some of the other things that are happening around net zero. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was launched in Glasgow. I was there in November this year at the COP26 meeting. This is bankers, this is asset managers, this is asset owners, all figuring out not only how to make their own operations net zero, but how to make their entire portfolios net zero. This is where the money is now going. I can talk a bit later if you like, if you have any questions about what happened at COP, but I think that's one of the most significant things. It was this driving force by the financial sector. And this is when Mark Carney was still governor of the Bank of England and his counterpart, the governor of the Bank of France. So this is in 2020. And here's what they said. They sent a letter saying carbon emissions have to decline by 45% in the next decade to get to net zero by 2050, which is the target which is now going right around the world. And what I think is an understatement, they said this requires a massive reallocation of capital. EU emissions reductions are now committed to, this is a Fit for 55, 55% reductions by 2030. And the UK, this is a legal obligation of 78% reduction in emissions by 2035. These are massive numbers in an incredibly short space of time, which means utter transformation. And it means transformation to every single sector without exception. So I'm now coming finally to the bit about us. The bit about the travel industry. This is, these are the shaming words. This is the train, brag, and fly shame words that were coming out about all of this before COVID hit. And I think I want to focus on two parts of the economy which are particularly important to the travel industry. So we've got, first of all, of course, airlines. I've put up here, first of all, KLM, because they started off in response to this whole flight shame thing, their program with this question. Do you always have to meet face-to-face? Could you take the train instead? I put this up there because I think it's extraordinary that an airline is trying to defend itself by saying, maybe you don't need to use our services. And I can understand why they're doing that. And I also think that now with net zero, it's not enough. We have to transform everything. It's not enough to say, just don't do it. But there's some cool things you can do. So this is the beautiful blended wing, they're called structures, but this is a vision of what an electric plane could look like for short haul. Also for short haul, much more likely and much more promising, I think, is the hydrogen revolution and the possibility of having hydrogen fuels to power short haul flights. But probably in the immediate future, it's all about sustainable aviation fuel. Sustainable aviation fuel that can come from waste fats and waste animal fats. It can come from biomass. And it can also come from captured CO2 from the air in this so-called fuels to liquids, where you capture the CO2. You have these banks of fans that blow air over carbon capture devices. You then take the CO2 and you turn it into the world's cleanest fuel. You can see straight through it, look at that. And this is a plant that's a pilot that's actually happening in Canada at the moment, and they're looking to expand. So there are solutions for airlines. There's also this potential solution, which is called offsetting. I just want to say something about offsetting before we go on, and maybe we'll come back to that in the panel as well. Offsetting has become a kind of dirty word. It's a kind of, we can get away with not doing stuff if we just sort of pay someone else to do it instead. And I'd like to say that I think there's a whole new lease of life for offsetting, and something I care particularly about. And in fact, I've just done a TED talk on, which I encourage you all to go and see, which is about carbon removals, actually taking CO2 back out of the sky and burying it. So this isn't traditional offsetting in the sense of you'll pay someone else not to emit, but your emissions still stay in the air. This is a what goes up must come down. I emit a ton, I have to pay someone to remove the ton, and the net is zero. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, first of all, in the voluntary markets and then in the compliance markets. So watch this space. This is what that looks like. This is a plant that's currently being designed and they're going to start construction in Texas to take CO2 out of the air and to bury it in geological formations. And I think this is particularly interesting because literally 2 or 3 days ago, Airbus just announced an advanced purchase of 100,000 tons of this facility per year for 4 years, 400,000 tons of CO2 removals. And that increased the current inventory by 550%. It's extraordinary. It's starting from a very low base. But that Airbus should do this shows already that this is going to be very important for the industry. Now, I've put Patagonia up in here because there's something else that this industry can do, which is ask the customers to pay the premium. So what can you actually do to get the signal out to the market that this market is real? And one of them is these big corporate purchases, these voluntary purchases that send this strong signal, a demand signal. And the other is to put something on the ticket. And the conventional wisdom is that if you do that, people won't pay. And people won't pay because, they can talk a good talk, but when it comes to adding extra money, they won't do it. Now, I spoke to one of the former CEOs of Patagonia who said that they tried it with cotton T-shirts, better cotton that had a different supply chain, but the cotton itself looked just the same, and nobody was buying it. Until they told the story. When they told the story of how this works, how it's contributing, how you're contributing from buying it, then people were willing to pay the premium. They'd pay 30% more, but they wouldn't pay 33% more. There was a price point, but they're still willing to pay the premium if you tell the story. So I want to put that in there as well because, old wisdom doesn't necessarily hold. This is actually about showing people how they can be part of the solution and giving people hope. Similarly, in the hospitality sector, this is Chris Nassetta from Hilton. More and more of our customers, he said, want us to lead. And so Hilton started off by doing, they were leaders in the field, a lot of things, building this proprietary tech. They reduced energy use by 22%, carbon emissions by 30%, water use by 22%, waste by more than 30%. This is the significant part of it. Cumulative savings of $1 billion. It doesn't have to cost, it can actually save. And now they have this new target to halve the environmental footprint by 2030. And that's been part, and I think IHG are part of this as well, the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance. Just about a week and a half ago, this came in, the Pathway to Net Positive Hospitality for the Planet, showing every single hotel chain, however big or small, how they can get onto this path from early days to leaders and demonstrate that they can actually do this, save money, and make this offering to their customers. I'm going to finish now with this. This is a glacier in Iceland. I was giving a talk in Iceland to another bunch of investors, and they told me about this glacier, which is just over the hill. And I was really interested in it. It's called Orc Glacier. And in 1986, this is what it looked like. And in 2019, this is what it looked like. It had gone. And so what the Icelandic people did, the Prime Minister and some ministers and some other environmental activists, they had a funeral for the glacier. They climbed over the rubble it had left behind, and they put a plaque there. And the plaque is a letter to the future. I just want to finish with that. Look at this. It's amazing. A letter to the future. Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. We do know what's happening, ladies and gentlemen. We do know what needs to be done. And we'd better do it.